Hello and welcome to another video to teach you about the wonderful world of Latin. Today's video will teach you about relative pronouns and relative clauses. This continues our look at all of the pronouns in Latin. We started with demonstrative adjectives, then learned personal, reflexive, and intensive pronouns. Today we will learn about relative pronouns and later on our interrogative pronouns, but we'll come back to those, so don't worry about those. And let's learn about our relative pronoun. To understand relative pronouns, we should look at the types of sentences in English: simple, compound, and complex. A simple sentence is a sentence containing one clause. For example, the pile of wood is on fire. There's one subject, the pile, and one verb, is. That's all we need for a clause in English. A compound sentence contains multiple clauses that are combined with a coordinating conjunction. For example, the pile of wood is on fire and it burns. And is a coordinating conjunction, joining the clause the pile of wood is on fire with the clause it burns. It's a coordinating conjunction because both of these clauses could stand on their own if they were separated from each other. A complex sentence is a sentence that contains multiple clauses combined with a subordinating conjunction or pronoun. For example, since the pile of wood is on fire, it burns. Since is your subordinating conjunction. So what do we mean by that? A subordinating conjunction makes the clause that it begins a subordinate clause or a lower order clause than the main independent clause. The independent clause can stand on its own. It burns can still be a complete sentence. However, that conjunction, since, makes its clause dependent or subordinate. It cannot stand on its own anymore. Since the pile of wood is on fire, we want to know more. It's not a complete sentence. So we're lacking information. That's why it's dependent or subordinate. A relative clause is a type of complex sentence. So let's look more closely at those. The relative pronoun in English is which or that, who, whose, and whom. Like I said, it creates a complex sentence. The antecedent, or the word that the pronoun replaces, is in the main clause, and the relative pronoun itself is in a subordinate clause or a dependent clause. To illustrate these, let's look at these four examples. We'll start with the first one. The dog which you love ate its dinner. Like I said, which is the relative pronoun, and its antecedent is in the main clause. The main clause of this sentence is the dog ate its dinner. Usually, and this is true in both English and Latin, usually the antecedent comes right before the relative pronoun. So the dog, it's who or what the relative clause tells us more about. And then we also are using which in this sentence for our relative pronoun because which and that are used for things. They're the pronouns for a thing. In our next sentence, the girl who loves you ate her dinner, the relative pronoun is who. And its antecedent, the word we're learning more about, is the girl. Who is used for people. In fact, whose and whom are also used for people. And if we're being very grammatically correct, who, whose, and whom have slightly different roles in their relative clauses. Who is the subject pronoun, whose is the possessive pronoun, and whom is the objective pronoun. So it's the direct object, indirect object, or object of a preposition. In the next two sentences, it's your turn to find the relative pronoun and antecedent, and then you can check your work. So pause the video. You're right if you said whom and whose are the relative pronoun and the boy is the antecedent in both sentences, actually. Now we're ready to look at the relative pronoun in Latin. The relative pronoun is quae, quod. That's its dictionary entry. And these are all of its forms. As you start copying them down, I will draw your attention to a few forms that are worth noticing. In the genitive singular, queus is the relative pronoun for all three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. That ius ending is consistent across a lot of pronouns, especially demonstratives. In the dative, there's the I, that's also common as a dative ending for pronouns. And then both of those cases are the only ones that start with a C. All the others start with a Q and a U. The accusative singular masculine follows the third declension em ending with quem. Quam follows first declension, and quod is similar to your demonstrative illud and istud, but it's the exact same as your nominative singular neuter because of the neuter rule. Most of the other forms of your relative pronoun follow first and second declension endings. The dative and ablative plural endings, quibus, follow the third declension. So that's your relative pronoun and its forms. Pause your video and finish copying them down, and hit play when you're ready to learn how this is used in Latin sentences. So, the relative pronoun is quae, quod. Like all other pronouns, it takes its gender and number from the antecedent. And also, like other pronouns, it takes its case from its function within its own clause. In this case, it's a subordinate or relative clause within the same sentence as the antecedent. And in Latin word order, the relative pronoun usually follows directly after its antecedent. To show you what all of these are, let's look at the example canis, quem, amas, canebat. This will help us also learn how to translate the relative pronoun. So you remember from our forms that quem is our form of quae, quod. In fact, it is the masculine accusative singular form. To figure out its antecedent, we should find all our other nouns. In fact, especially ones that have a masculine and singular number. Conveniently, there is only one other noun in our sentence, canis. It is also masculine and singular, so it is our antecedent of quem. It's fine that they are a different case because the function of quem comes from its relative clause, quem amas, and the case for canis comes from its clause, canis canebat. So to start translating this, we can start with our antecedent and then move directly into our relative pronoun, the dog, which, and then finish translating our relative clause, quem amas, the dog which you love, and then we only have one word left, canebat, which returns us to the main clause. So the dog which you love was eating dinner. Once you finish taking notes, we can move on to our next example. As another example, we have the sentence nauta regem qui agricolas adiuverat et quius uxor erat iucunda fortisque ne cavit. The first task is to find the relative pronouns. Pause the video and find them. You're right if you said they are quae and queus. This implies that there will be 3 clauses, 2 relative clauses, and 1 main clause, because the relative clause is subordinate and depends on that independent clause. To confirm this, we can also find our verbs. They are adiuerat, erat, and nicavit. There are 3 verbs, which means there are 3 Latin clauses. And then that confirms that we have 2 subordinate clauses and 1 independent clause. We also need to separate out where one clause begins and the next ends. The relative pronoun will always start our clause. So quae and queus start the relative clauses. Just like with most of our sentences, the verb comes at the end of a relative clause, like quae agricolas adiuerat. So that ends that clause. With our other relative clause, it's just when the sense of that clause ends. Quius uxor erat doesn't fully complete the meaning, but quius uxor erat iucunda fortisque does. Now that we understand where our clauses are, how many of them there are, our next task is to find the relative pronouns antecedents. So pause the video and find them. To help us find them, I have parsed all of the words in this sentence. For the relative clause or relative pronouns, I've given all the options possible. Quae can be masculine, nominative, singular, or plural. So to find its antecedent, we need something that's masculine and singular or plural. We work backwards in the sentence because the antecedent usually comes right before the relative pronoun, which means our best candidate is regem, and it can be masculine accusative singular, so it is our antecedent of quae. Then queus can be any gender, genitive, and singular. We go backwards. We can skip over our relative clause because the conjunction et joins our 2 relative clauses, and then our first noun that we come to as we go backwards is regem, and it can possibly be our antecedent because it is any gender and singular. And it's okay that they are all different cases here because they take their cases from the clause that they're in, not from the antecedent. So we know regem is our antecedent for quae and queus. Next, we need to translate our main independent clause. So do so, and then you can resume the video. The sailor killed the king is a good translation of nauta regem nicavit. You notice that here I started with the main clause, where in the last example I focused first on the relative clause. In this example, I wanted to try something different. It also usually helps to start with the main clause and then add in the information that comes from your relative clause. If you're typing up your translation, you can just move your cursor, but if you're writing it out, it may require you to erase things, but it will ultimately lead you to a better understanding of how the sentence works. So now that we have our main independent clause translated, our next step is to translate the relative clauses. So pause the video, translate them, and then check your work. You're right if you said the sailor killed the king who had helped the farmers, quae agricolas adiuerat, and whose wife, et queus uxor, was pleasant and brave. Hopefully, walking you through the sentence has made a lot more sense of how to translate the sentence with the relative pronoun and other sentences with relative pronouns. If you have more questions, you can call me over and I will help clarify things. Or if you don't have questions, you can call me over and I will give you your homework. Thank you for watching this video.